very fortunate to be surrounded by people who I trust and can go to for wisdom. And this week we're thinking about wisdom, the wisdom of each other. And Steve introduced the subject yesterday, why wisdom? And I'm thinking a little bit today about wisdom when we gather together. I often say to our team here, I do not know how I would manage without you. It's just a joy and a gift to be able to lean on each other. And I hope and trust that you've all had teams like that, where that you just being in each other's company is just gives opportunities for wisdom to be poured out. I want to very briefly remind you of 3 house churches in the Acts of the Apostles. But before that, I just want to share briefly 3 stories of my own where I found wisdom in group settings. One of them, probably if I start with this one, you won't be able to think of anything else for the rest of the day. There's a thought. I was born and raised in Zimbabwe and ministered in churches in Zimbabwe. And one day we got a call from the village head. The village head was an important man in the rural area that we were working in, and he had 4 wives. And one of his, the youngest wife, was an entrepreneur. She knew how to make money, and she made money, and became a member of the Mothers Union. And if you do so in Zimbabwe, the big thing is for you to get the uniform. So she got herself a uniform, and she was very, very pleased. Problem: she was the youngest wife. Senior wife wanted her uniform. Answers on a postcard. So we were called. This is 70 miles away from where I was based. 70 miles. We were called to intervene, and I was very fortunate to take a wise group of the Mothers Union to go and sit under trees. And I missed this. Sit under some trees for the whole day, working this issue out. I was fortunate. I didn't get the nod. Not enough wisdom here. So I went and did some pastoral work visiting. And these ladies sat under a tree and discussed together and resolved the situation together. But just you can imagine being under that, being a tree on that fly, being a fly on that tree. and just having the opportunity of seeing wisdom being shared, and really. And another opportunity of a weekend where I experienced great wisdom was actually on a silent retreat. It was here. There were 6 or 7 of us, I think, on the retreat for the weekend. And we were silent from after Friday evening's meal until the Sunday lunchtime, where we spoke together. And I'll never forget the Sunday lunchtime when we were given permission to speak. It was like we'd been together the whole weekend, chatting together, knew each other's stories, knew everything about each other. But the wisdom that we had gained from each other by saying nothing was so valuable. And the third story, also one of the stories, one of the weekends that I really loved, was on a men's weekend here, sitting around a fire under a tree with a piece of wood in our hands and a knife, and we were whittling together. You can imagine the wisdom being poured out by this group of men. Don't go there. But you can just imagine from any one of those 3 scenarios, can't you? Just the sitting together and talking together and sharing wisdom together. So 3 house churches. Lydia's house church, Priscilla and Aquila's house church, and Diotrephes and Demetrius's house church. I'm just going to very quickly paint the stories of these 3 they didn't have church buildings in those days. They met in houses together. It probably wouldn't have been very many people gathering together, but they would have sat together and learned together and shared together. Lydia's story is really, really interesting because she was first meeting with a group of ladies outside of the town where they lived, by the lake, and it was the Sabbath day. And the 3 or 4 verses goes, on the Sabbath we, that's Paul, Timothy, Silas, and Luke, we went outside the city gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the woman who had gathered there. The women were devout Jewish women who had come to pray, and they had gathered on the Sabbath. They couldn't constitute a synagogue there, but they had gathered to pray. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshipper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. It is believed that her house became the church, the Philippi church, a significant church. But it starts off as a group of Jewish ladies praying to God, meet Jesus, get baptized, and suddenly a house church is formed, and they're sitting together, talking together. And I don't know, I can't get the sort of things that they might have been talking about, the sort of things that they would have been dealing with. I mean, we can imagine because of the persecution, because of the trouble, but also because of the fact that they were having to learn anew. How does this work? How do we worship now that Jesus Christ is involved? How does this work out? There would have been so many different questions. So that's Lydia's group. Priscilla and Aquila. I just love these few verses. Priscilla and Aquila, Paul reminds us in Romans chapter 16, had their own house church. Greet them in the house where they meet. And then in Acts chapter 18, there's this lovely cameo of Priscilla and Aquila educating Apollos. Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor. Sounds like me. And taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. I just love that. It's just lovely. There he was, speaking fervently and educating people. And Priscilla probably, because she would have been the leader, the lady of the house. Priscilla always named first. Priscilla and Aquila invite Apollos, would you mind coming home with us? We'd like to speak to you about God and how you may speak more adequately. He was a learned man, educated man, but the wisdom that was shared with him on that day transformed his ministry going forward. Be a fly on that wall. Very interesting picture. And then Diotrephes and Demetrius in the 3rd epistle of John. This is a completely contrasting story, and I wanted to throw it in because there are groups where things don't go smoothly. Is that right? Do you know groups like that? Probably, yes. So John the elder writes to Gaius, who the letter is written to, and he says, I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to be first, will not welcome us. So when I come, I will call attention to what he is doing, spreading malicious nonsense about us. Sounds like Paul, not like John. But he was really calling the shots. This guy's out of kilter with what it is we're supposed to be doing. Not satisfied with that, he even refuses to welcome other believers. He also stops those who want to do so and puts them out of church. What kind of a house church leader was this guy? Dear friends, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. Anyone who does what is good is from God. Anyone who does what is evil has not seen God. And then he promotes Demetrius. Demetrius is well spoken of by everyone, and even by the truth itself. We also speak well of him, and you know that our testimony is true. So I share 3 stories of 3 different scenarios: a group of Jewish ladies who become Christians, and Lydia's household is baptized, and this house church turns into a really loving, beautiful. The letter to the Philippians paints the picture of what a group of people they were. What and how was wisdom shared among that group of people? And then we see Priscilla and Aquila with Apollos, gently, lovingly, kindly, humbly sharing with him their wisdom to educate him to be more adequate in his instruction of the gospel. And then Diotrephes, who is tearing this house church apart, chucking people out of the church, out of the house church, refusing to let other people come in. What was going on in that house church? And where was wisdom being shared or not being shared? We're thinking about how we share wisdom in each other, and I suspect we've all got our own scenarios that we're all familiar with, where we get wisdom, but we've also been in situations where we don't get wisdom, where we see, sadly, the opposite. I do miss the days of being in the Zimbabwean rural areas, taking the gospel and preaching to people who were probably very excited to see a white man. Some of them certainly might not have seen a white man before, some of the children obviously, and sharing something with them, sitting under trees and learning about them and their culture and learning from each other. And as I think about what the early church must have been like, obviously the place to go to is Acts chapter 2, where we discover how these groups were set up and how they operated and how they helped each other. And Acts chapter 2 tells us that 4 things went on in these house churches, 4 things specifically. Number 1, they listened to the apostles' teaching. How did the apostles' teaching come? It didn't come in a book, did it? It came because I remember I heard him say. That's how wisdom was shared. I heard him say, and it was amazing. You are the salt of the earth. There's wisdom. So while they were together, they shared stories together. They learned from each other. The second thing they did was the fellowship of each other, the fellowship of the Holy Spirit, and the fellowship of the Lord. And you can imagine how strong that was for them, because they were new people coming together, experiencing a new religion, a new understanding of how they were to live their lives. Thirdly, they broke bread together. Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me." So they broke bread together to remember Jesus. Jesus was at the center of their meetings. And fourthly, they prayed together. It's just interesting the way Luke, who writes the Acts of the Apostles, speaks of those 4 things. The more I thought about this group of people, the more I thought, what an interesting group of people it was. Because we remember, of course, that they were Jews and Gentiles together in one house. Did Jews and Gentiles get on? No. So they would have been sharing each other's cultures, they would have been sharing each other's religions, and they would have been sharing, and this is what holds people together in the faith, they would have been sharing that which set their hearts on fire with love for Jesus. But you can imagine the crisscross of stuff that was going on there. I think I can. I come from Zimbabwe, and once a year I took the risk of inviting the rural areas to join me in the urban areas for a big church service. And for once a year we had black people and white people worshipping together and then praying for each other and doing things that they'd never thought of doing for each other. I remember a white lady came to me after the service once and said, "A black lady put her hand on my head and prayed for me. It was amazing." What was going on in these groups and what goes on in the groups that you share in? As I was preparing yesterday, Steve was bared with me. He came in 2 or 3 times and asked how it was going, and he watched the progression of the preparation being worked out. And I found myself sitting at James's feet. James. Steve spoke about Proverbs yesterday. Wisdom literature. James is the wisdom literature of the New Testament. James is actually the book of Proverbs in the New Testament. It's a string of things that James has put together like beads. It's called charaz in Hebrew. Like beads, he strung all of these things together and put them together and written a letter. But if you read it through the eyes of Proverbs, you will see how that works. But in the middle of James, he speaks about wisdom. Dave, if you could put it up on the screen, please. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, of the devil. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom, please read with me, but the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness. Isn't that fascinating? James gives us a very clear understanding of what earthly wisdom is like and what divine wisdom is like. And it's about a quality. It's about a way of life. It's not necessarily about a proclamation. Steve started off yesterday morning by quoting Proverbs. The beginning of wisdom is, who can remember? The beginning of wisdom is, get wisdom. The beginning of wisdom is, get wisdom. I finish off with James today. If anyone lacks wisdom, ask for it.